Should you study a complex poker strategy with many different sizes, or should you use a simplified strategy that's easier to learn? In today's lecture, I'm going to go over the trade-offs between complexity and simplicity, and I'm going to show you how you can get the most value from your study time. Hi everyone. Before we begin, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. Your support helps us create more content. Thanks and enjoy the video. In today's video, I'm going to cover the trade-offs between a complex and a simplified strategy. We'll also go over custom solving best practices, and I'm going to show you how to use GTO Wizard to build a simplified strategy. Then I'm going to show you a way you can prioritize spots so we can figure out what are the most valuable spots you should be practicing for your current stage in your poker development. And finally, we'll look at how you can practice against your own custom-built solutions. Did you know that more than 95% of GTO Wizard nodes have never been observed by the human eye? That's wild to think about. In fact, the vast majority of the GTO Wizard library has never been viewed, not once. And the reason is that if you look at any typical GTO solution from flop to river, there can be tens of millions of decision points. Tens of millions, considering all of the different possible runouts and bet sizes and lines that can occur. And so it goes to show that as a human thinking about poker, you really don't need the world's most complex strategy in order to develop strong poker skills. As a human, you're not trying to memorize, you're trying to learn heuristics. So how do we navigate the tightrope between complexity and simplicity? Well, let's start by examining the trade-offs. The simplified strategy is easier to implement. It's less noisy because it's easier to solve, easier to study because you're using fewer bet sizes, and it less accurately represents the game space. This is the main trade-off. If you give a solver one bet size, for example, it may exploit the limitations of your betting tree. So that can make it less robust. If a solver wasn't expecting to see, for example, an overbet or some pot-sized raise in some spot, the strategy it outputs isn't necessarily going to be good when you map it to the actual real game. However, complex strategies also have some problems, so they're harder to implement, right? Good luck implementing a 4-sizing split on any flop, that's crazy. It's a lot more noisy, harder to study, but it does more accurately represent the game space. And it's more robust. That is to say, it is less exploitable to bet sizes and raise sizes outside of its abstraction. Now, each of these have some use case. Complex strategies are great for examining, for example, bet sizing theory or seeing how you should defend against uncommon lines. And simplified strategies, in my opinion, are better for practicing against, better for trying to find something really implementable. But ideally, we want the best of both worlds. And that's why we invented dynamic solving. So dynamic solving is our algorithm that automatically simplifies and optimizes bet sizes at every decision point. It's easier to study, it finds optimal bet sizes, it's easier to solve, and it's robust, meaning it's less exploitable than a simple strategy. When you use dynamic sizing, you're not telling the solver to choose one size in every spot, you're telling it to choose the optimal bet size in every spot, according to the ranges, the stack, the pot, and the specific cards on the board that you're currently looking at. So the natural follow-up to this question is, what happens when you simplify your strategy to one size? How does the GTO strategy change as compared to something more complex that's using many sizes? And what you'll find if you play around with this tool is that the solution will often bet more than usual when you lower the average bet size, and it's going to bet less often when you increase the average bet size. We'll also typically see that when you're putting many different hands into the same bet size, you have less of an opportunity to polarize, and therefore the defender typically calls just a little bit wider. However, the total amount of money going into the pot is often very similar, and moreover, the expected value is almost identical. So people think that there's a huge EV loss from simplifying your strategy. The truth is not really. It's very, very minute. The real benefits to a more complex strategy are things like you can study bet sizing theory and perhaps your line makes a bit more sense for your hand class. But as far as the expected value of complications go, you would be amazed how small they are. So the easiest way for me to show you this is to simply dive into some GTO Wizard examples. I'm going to show you how to set this up, and we'll compare one spot. For my first example, I've selected a cutoff versus big blind single raise pot on 10-9-5 two-tone. Action checks to the aggressor, and here you can see they're using many different sizes. Now, if you want to follow along, I'm using these NL500 general solutions. These are highly accurate solutions, and they're solved with many different sizes, so they're quite robust and a little complex. And we'll see here that the solver in this spot wants to split all different sizes. It likes some overbetting, it likes the 75%, it likes the half pot, even a little bit of 33%. The solver has no qualms splitting 4 different sizes. Now you may be wondering, why on earth would the solver want to choose 4 different bet sizes? Well, you have to keep in mind that a GTO solver doesn't care about your feelings, and it doesn't care how complicated the strategy is. The only thing it cares about is maximizing expected value at all costs, right? And if it's going to take 4 sizes to do that, then that's what it's going to choose. Even if a one-sizing strategy is, only loses like 0.1%, it doesn't care. It's going to use the more complex strategy. So I'm going to show you how we can simplify this down to 1 size, and then we're going to compare how much EV that loses and how the opponent's response and how our strategy changes. So I'm going to go build a new solution that only uses one of these sizes. Hit the Solution selector in the top left corner, and then select the Custom Solutions tab. From here, we're going to build our own brand new solution. So the first thing we're going to do here is figure out the ranges, pot size, and stack size. And instead of filling all of this out manually, I'm just going to import it. So I'll hit this little pre-fill button. I'm going to select Cutoff versus Big Blind Single Raise Pot. Okay, and we can see that this has populated both the player's ranges, stack, and pot size. Next, we're going to build the betting tree. Now, if you don't want to do this, you can just hit automatic. That's fine. I'm going to model it so that it's using the same sizes that we had in the general solution. So we had a 33% bet, we had a half pot bet, we had a 75 and a 125, and the raise sizes are always half pot, full pot, and all in. 1E is just a geometric sizing. That just means get it in over 1 bet, or in this case, shoving. I could customize it further, but this is enough to make a simple example. So we'll go ahead and create this new solution, and we will select 10, 9, 5, two-tone. Same situation, same ranges, same boards. The only difference now is that the solver has automatically simplified my strategy to use 1 bet size. So the first thing to note is that I didn't tell it to choose 75%. The dynamic sizing algorithm says, here are 4 or 5 or 6 different sizes to choose from. Choose me the size that makes the most money. And in this case, on this board, given these ranges, that happens to be about 75% pot. However, if we go ahead and change this board, so 987, it's going to prefer a different bet size. So here, it actually prefers the half pot size on 987. What if we pick something dry? For example, King 5-5. Well, now it's probably going to down bet. I expect it'll use a small bet size here, and indeed it does. Now it wants to bet small, 33%. Okay, well, what if we give it something like Ace King 6 Rainbow? Well, now it's probably going to overbet because this is a very good board to overbet, and indeed it does. So depending on what parameters it's receiving, it will change and optimize the bet size automatically, simplifying between whatever sizes you've told it to choose from. Okay, so now that we understand the dynamic solving algorithm, let's go back to my original solve here. So what would happen if we were to change this bet size? What if we simplify to something else instead? For example, perhaps you prefer a smaller bet on this board. What you're going to notice is that it's going to bet more often, and this should be kind of obvious to the more advanced players, but here I've told it to bet third pot, and we'll give it a second, and you can see that the bet sizing increases. We're almost betting 2/3 of the time now. And this is because we're putting in less money into the pot with this third pot bet, and therefore it wants to bet more frequently. And conversely, we could do the opposite test. What happens if we pump this up to like a pot-sized bet? We're going to see that now it's betting less often, okay? And so the amount you can bet is closely tied to what's called a betting volume, which basically indicates the total average EV of money you're putting into the pot. So if you want to bet larger, you have to bet less frequently. If you want to bet smaller, you have to bet more frequently, and so on and so forth. Now that said, some boards are going to have more efficient sizings than others. So for example, if I change this to like something like King 4-4, what ends up happening is that it wants to use a very small size, and a larger size just isn't going to be super efficient here. So, for example, here's bet 61% for a small size. If I put this up to like a pot-sized bet, we're going to find that it can't bet very often at all. Here, it's only betting 22% of the time. This is a very inefficient sizing given how polarized big blind's range is. Big blind's range is mostly going to be nuts or air at this point. And in fact, we're betting so little that they even are going to start to develop a donking strategy. Conversely, if we change this to something that prefers an overbet, like ace, king, 6 again, you can see that the default GTO strategy is to overbet, bet 125% pot here. Now, what happens if we were to give it a small size? I know a lot of players like to just range bet these boards for a small size. Well, we're going to find that it's just going to range bet, right? This is such an advantageous board that you can just bet super wide. This is a playable strategy. You're not going to get as much money with your nutted hands, for example, but it's still a playable strategy. And so overall, the goal is to put in approximately the same amount of money overall. Now, I'm going to change this back to my original solution. And here we're going to compare this strategy against the general solution. So first thing we'll notice is that it's betting a little bit less often compared to the general solution. Here we can see the original pre-sold solution, which used many different sizes, and it's only checking 44% of the time. If we simplify that, we can see it's betting 55% of the time. And in our simplified case, it's betting less often. And this is because, again, we've increased the amount of money we're putting into the pot with this one bet size. So it's going to bet a little less frequently, but it's pretty close to optimal. Next, I'm going to show you how to compare EV properly in GTO Wizard. So the way to do this is to select the Ranges tab. And this is a really important step. Always select the root node. That is to say, the very first decision point in the solution. And the reason for this is that the ranges can change if you change the bet sizings. And so it's best practice to always compare at the root. Over here, we see the expected value of both players, 1.88 for big blind, 3.22 for the cutoff. And these numbers in white here, this is the EV as a percentage of the pot. So cutoff's expected value is 3.22 big blinds. All right, let's go ahead and just write that down. So simplified strategy wins 3.22 big blinds. Now, let's see what happens if I amend cutoff strategy. I'm going to give them small size, a medium size, a larger size, some overbet, and you know what? Let's go ahead and just give them an all-in as well. How will that change the expected value? Now, I could compare it to the general solutions, but keep in mind that these GTO Wizard AI solutions, for now, don't have any rake, so I'm using this to get a fair comparison. And what you'll notice, if we go back to the root node, is that the expected value doesn't really change at all. It's still 3.22 big blinds. So more complex strategy, 3.22. The EV change is basically non-existent on this particular flop. Now, some spots, it's definitely going to change. So for example, if I give them an inappropriate bet size, so let's say third pot here, it's not a great sizing for this board, we're going to see that the EV at the root node will definitely decrease. Okay, so instead of 3.22, now it's 3.2. So we lost 0.2 big blinds. Again, it just doesn't feel like we've lost much at all, right? It's less than 1% loss. But you really need to put this into perspective, guys, because EV on the flop, even if you give it the worst possible betting tree, which is no betting tree, so I'm just going to I'm going to force it to check back everything. And you'll see here, like, it's not allowed to bet. We'll notice that the EV, oh, what's this? What's this? The EV's gone up? No. Again, this is why you compare at the root node, because big blind, now that they know cutoff won't bet, has a donking strategy. And so if you want to compare fairly, you have to compare at the root node. So cutoff's EV has become 3.04 in this case. This is our lower bound. The worst possible betting strategy we could give it wins 3.04. And so realistically, typically speaking, if you give your solver a really bad tree, the expected value as a percentage of the pot will just approach the equity. And if you're doing this on earlier streets like a flop, it can always make up for that on turn and river. It can kind of compensate for whatever terrible betting tree you've given it by, betting more on later streets, for example. Now, that said, we can see here that EV loss of complex versus simple strategies, really, there's not a big difference, guys. And anyone who's telling you, you need to play a more complex strategy to win more money, I don't really buy that anymore, to be honest. I just don't think that there's going to be a huge EV difference. One caveat I should warn you guys about is that GTO Wizard AI uses neural networks to estimate the expected value. So this is not going to be accurate to like 0.00001% accuracy or whatever, right? You have to always consider that there's some margin of error in here. Typically about 0.2, 0.3% of the pot is going to be the margin of error. Now, with all that said, let's talk a little more about complex strategies. A lot of people, they think that, it's one or the other. It has to be either super simple, super complex. But realistically, there's quite a lot of room to adjust. And those complex strategies still have their place because they could take your opponent out of their game tree. And in chess, you might call this a gambit. In poker, we often see pros like Stefan doing this, for example. And it reminds me of a famous chess player, Mikhail Tal, who said, sometimes you have to take your opponent into a deep, dark forest where 1 + 1 = 3, and the path out is only wide enough for one. His quote being that sometimes you got to take your opponent off their game in order to win. Anyway, that's enough chess theory for now. Let's get back to poker. So something I've done to try and double check this is graph the expected value of just a ton of different boards and spots here, depending on what size we chose. And in this case, we can see that, 25%, 42%, 71%, 100, 125. We can see that the expected value change, that is to say the difference compared to having no bet size, maxes out around this 70% mark, right? And on some boards, that's what happens. On other boards, you're going to see it's a little more flat. So you'll see like many different sizes are fine. On some boards, we get more of a hump where one size is best, depending on how many different playable strategies there are. But overall, the EV difference is not huge, right? It's this one scales between 0 and 3.6% between the worst and the best size. So simply put, simplifying doesn't lose a whole lot of EV on the flop anyway, because it can course correct later streets. So a concept I've referenced throughout this video is what's called betting volume. And this is just a fancy way for saying how much money you're putting into the pot right now. You might as well just call it average bet size. It means the same thing. So the way you quantify this is to take the sum of the sizes times the frequencies. That means bet size 1 times frequency 1 plus bet size 2 times frequency 2, and so on until you get some average bet size. Now, if we do that with our original strategies we're looking at, this is the general solution, which had a more complex strategy, 4 different bet sizes, 4 different frequencies. Here I'm showing it in big blinds rather than percentage of pot, just for clarity. Works out to 2 big blinds. So in this case, we were betting on average between all 4 of these sizes, 2 big blinds into a 5.1 big blind pot. Okay? Now, let's go take a look at the simplified strategy. Well, again, here we can see 3.8 big blinds times 51.7%, and that works out to about 2 big blinds. Again, it is a very small difference here, but essentially the solver is going to try and fight to use approximately the same betting volume. In a lot of cases, not always, but in a lot of cases, if you bet bigger, it's going to bet less frequently. If you bet smaller, it's going to bet more often, depending on the efficiency of the bet size. So generally speaking, even when you simplify, it's still going to be putting in the same amount of money overall, as long as you're using some reasonable sizes. So going back, we answered all of these questions already. We can see that how often we bet is largely dependent on whether or not we're sizing up or down, and it's going to try and make it so it's a similar betting volume overall. And we saw that simplifying, well, on the flop especially, doesn't lose much EV at all. So the reason to play a more complex strategy is not to make more money. Let's just admit that right off the bat. The theoretical gain from a complex strategy is, well, basically below the margin that we can accurately measure EV. All right, it's that small. So the reason to play a more complex strategy has to do with things like bet sizing theory, has to do with whether or not you want to take your opponent off their game, whether you think you can exploit some sort of bet sizing elasticity tendency of theirs, or if you just like to mix it up, right? What is not a real argument is saying that you play a more complex strategy because it's higher EV, because frankly, it's just not really much higher EV, okay? So let's move on to another test that we can do, and this is something we did to benchmark our dynamic solving algorithm. And to do this, we tested 500 heads-up river spots to find out. Why river spots? Well, because on the river, you can't course correct later streets, and the solver will lose the maximum amount of money. So we wanted to deliver the most pain possible to our simplifications. Really just punish it as hard as possible. As it turns out, compared to playing a very complex strategy on the river, our dynamic solving algorithm loses about 0.3% pot as compared to playing a very complex strategy with like 6 or 7 different sizes. And we also tested against the single best size. So that is to say, our dynamic algorithm tried to find the best size, and then we solved all the sizes manually and compared. Turns out, also barely losing an EV, so it's a pretty accurate algorithm. So my point is simply that dynamic solving by itself is pretty accurate as far as it goes. It's not going to lose much EV compared to playing any other one-size strategy. And compared to playing some impossibly complex strategy that you have no chance of implementing, it loses maybe a third of the pot. So simplifying down to one size really doesn't lose much EV on the flop and even on the river. If you want to learn more about these benchmarks, we have an article. I'll link that in the description. Something else I want to show you guys is what is the optimal bet size. So we didn't just compare the dynamic sizing algorithm. We also tried to find the best possible bet size on the river if you're going to simplify to one size. And so what we did is we measured the EV loss of playing, for example, a half pot bet in every single spot compared to the more complex strategy. So out of position, we can see that out of position prefers about a half pot bet. This had the lowest median loss rate of about 0.39. So if you're going to simplify to one size out of position on the river, about a half pot bet should do it. In position preferred a larger size. So we can see the size that lost the least was about 75%. Now that said, there are some boards that really wanted to go pot or a little bit bigger. But if you're going to go one size everywhere, 75% to 100% in position on the river is the way to go. And I'll be honest, I was a little surprised to see how little simplifying to one size loses. And we can see dynamic, of course, had the best performance because it's going to use a smaller bet when appropriate and a larger bet when appropriate. But hey, if you really want to simplify, here's the numbers for you. So you can have a look at this, play around with this graph, and let me know what you guys think. Let's talk about custom solving best practices. So I've shown you how to experiment with it a bit, but the very first thing you should do if you're new to this is read the guides. We have built an extensive database of guides that teach you everything there is to know about custom solving. We've got these videos, we've got this overview page, we've got this article that'll walk you through how to build custom solutions, all right? So you can see how to get started, building the betting tree, saving, loading, organizing. Everything you need to know is in these guides. You want to learn how to train against your solutions, how to practice against them. We have a guide for that as well, right here. How to train against custom solutions, okay? It's actually pretty straightforward. If you have just some common questions and you want to try and find a quick answer, well, we've got that here as well. So the very first thing to do is to read the guides and master the tools. That way you can get the most value from your subscription. The next thing to do when you're building a betting tree is to space your bet sizes far apart. Realistically, a solver is going to have a very hard time distinguishing between the trade-offs of a 55% and a 67% pot size bet. You really need to space those bet sizes further apart. Don't try and use like a million sizes and clump them close together. It's not a good idea. What I typically suggest is to have 3 sizes, your small, medium, and big bet. But you should also pay attention to the stack to pot ratio. For example, if you're studying a 4-bet pot where there's only like an SPR of 2, you're not going to need an overbet, right? Maybe your biggest size would be like, maybe use like 20%, 50% all in. That's plenty good enough for like a 4-bet pot. But in a single race pot, for example, you might want to spread it out a bit more, 33, 75, 125, spread your bet sizes out a little bit. And that brings me to my next point, which is to reuse the betting trees, okay? You don't need to remake the betting tree each and every time. If you've gone and customized sizes for your specific spot, you can reuse those. And let me show you how. So I'm back at my custom solution here. I'll hit edit here. And here we can see that we've built this specific bet sizing scheme. This one's not overly complicated, but what we can do is just save it. And we'll call this my betting tree, okay? You can save this as a new betting tree, and we can also go and load old ones. So here we see I have all of these different betting tree schemes, and I can go and reuse these for different spots. Something else I can do is I can choose to only load the bet sizes, right? So for example, here's my more simplified one that I use for practicing against the solution. This is same ranges, same stack, same pot, but Now I'm using my preloaded betting tree, which has 3 bet sizes and is pretty easy to play. Next, you'll want to make sure that if you're doing any sort of EV comparisons, always compare at the root node of the solution rather than the current node. And that's because players can change their strategies on earlier streets if you give them different sizes or node lock something. So you want to be careful to compare at the root node. And finally, just experiment, right? Some people, they don't want to experiment. They just want to learn and study and memorize. Me personally, I love making graphs and trying different things and giving it wacky sizes and trying to break it. I love experimenting with the solver because I can learn new ideas from changing the parameters and studying those underlying cause-effect principles. So don't be afraid to mess around with it and try something new. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you're about to get the little pot of gold that I left at the end. So one of the most common questions we get at GTO Wizard is, how do I prioritize spots? What do I know what to study next, and how do I quantify this? That's what we're going to cover now. So a spot in poker is like button versus big blind single raise pot, cutoff versus small blind 3-bet pot. It's a configuration. And so what we want to know is what configurations are the most important, as in how much do they contribute to your win rate? How do we quantify this? And how do we figure out what we should practice next? So I spent some time trying to quantify this. Now, what most coaches and stables are doing is they're calculating a sort of spot EV, which is to say how often does the spot occur multiplied by how big the starting pot is. So we're going to do just that. Let's figure out what configurations are the most valuable and how we can figure out what you should be practicing next. So let me show you what I've done. I have looked at 42 different configurations, starting from button versus big blind single raise pot, all the way down to some of these 3-bet, 4-bet pots. And I've used special software to calculate the frequency that each of these spots occur, accounting for card removal and bunching effect and all of that. And then we know the starting pot size, and we can calculate the expected value of that spot. So for example, a button versus big blind pot, single raise pot, occurs about 5% of the time in a GTO 6 max game, and I'm using NL 500 rake structure with GTO sizes here. That means that this spot contributes significantly to our win rate because it occurs very frequently. But we'll also see, for example, a button versus small blind single raise pot occurs infrequently. It's not very common, but because the pot is much bigger, it has a larger impact on our win rate, which we can see down here. And so this EV column is basically just frequency times the pot size, and that tells us how important different spots are to practice. If we sort this from A to Z, we'll see that most of these single raise pots, these are going to be the most important, followed by some of these 3-bet and 4-bet pots. And if you're new to poker, what I'd recommend is just take, for example, like the top 5 or 10 spots here, and just practice these first, because these are going to have the most significant impact on your win rate. Now, that said, I clearly admit that for different formats, for example, if you're like a full ring live player, I kind of doubt that blind versus blind is the most common spot in a live cash game. Probably people are opening too wide, so you get more of this stuff, under the gun versus big blind kind of stuff. Or maybe you get more cold call spots like this. Regardless, it gives us a nice starting place to figure out what the most important spots are. Now, I wanted to improve on the current methods that people are using. So something else I did was to calculate the average pot size, right? On a button versus big blind single raise pot, we start at 5.5 big blinds on the flop, but chances are people are going to bet and put more money in. And so I also calculated how big the average pot is going to be in GTO, and you can change the EV calculation here. So average pot size, and this reorders the EVs a little bit, but we still see very similar trends overall. And here we can see, again, which spots are going to be more important to us. Now, I wanted to take it a step further because, sure, maybe we know like the top 5, 10 most important spots, but what if you want to practice certain spots? What if you spend a lot of time practicing, for example, single raise pots, and so you're getting a decent score there in our practice mode, and this is just the GTO Wizard score, so you can create like a drill for these single raise pots and type in your score. Then what we're going to see is that there's a practice priority column. And this indicates what you should practice next. The way this one works is it looks at your GTO Wizard score and it says, okay, how much EV can we gain from practicing this spot next? The way this works is by taking 1 minus your GTO Wizard score and then raising that to some power. In this case, I've chosen 3. And this just kind of reflects the fact that it's much easier to go from 70 to 80 than it is to go from 80 to 90 or from 90 to 95. So it respects the fact that spots you're doing worse in, like for example, if I put in like an atrocious score in these 4-bet pots, let's say 50% or 50%, it's going to say, no, you really ought to practice this next. Even though it's uncommon, you can easily up your score here and gain a lot of win rate, right? And so you can adjust this parameter. I recommend a value between 2 and 4. And this just basically determines how much it's going to weigh your current GTO Wizard score and how much that should affect your practice priority. So let's put that up to 70. Let's say, for example, that, okay, we know we're doing pretty good in single raise pots. What should we practice next? Okay, well, let me sort the practice priority, and okay, we should do some button versus blind 3-bet pot stuff. So let's say we practice that a bit and we bump our score up to, let's say, 80 and 82%. Okay, now these are looking pretty good. What should we do next? Well, again, I'm just going to sort this table, and okay, so now it's time for some cut off versus button 3-bet pot stuff. So we keep going like that, slowly upping our score and improving one step at a time. And again, the goal of all of this is to just know where you should focus your attention next and how you can get the most value for your training time. So that way you're not practicing spots that are going to add very little to your win rate. You're practicing spots that are more important. Now, something else I wanted to do here was to look at the aggregated stats. So I've grouped these in 3 different ways. On the left-hand side here, what we see is pre-flop aggressor in position 3-bet pot, or pre-flop aggressor out of position 3-bet pot, so on and so forth. And we can see this is just the expected value that single raise pots, by far, in position single raise pots is going to add the most to your win rate, followed only by out of position. So this includes blind versus blind and some cold call spots, and then followed by some 3-bet pots. Next, I wanted to look at the, just 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, and single raise pots. Now, you may be tempted to think that, it's all single raise pots, but the fact is that single raise pots add a lot to your EV, but so do 3-bet pots. There's more 3-bet pots in total. So if we go take a look at the data, we can see that there's a whole lot of red stuff here, 3-bet pots. There many more of them exist than single raise pots. So they account for almost as much EV as single raise pots. And then 4-bet pots are basically not as important. Lastly, I categorized EV by position. Now this isn't win rate by position. This is the size of the pot times the frequency. So if you're going to get really, really good at one position in particular, I'd recommend it be the big blind. And this kind of makes sense because this is where the majority of your losses should come from trying to defend your blind, being forced to put in money. And the rest of it just kind of follows what you might expect. Button next, small blind after that, and so on. And so you can use this to get a sense of the overall group stats. I'll make a copy of the spreadsheet and put it in the description. Again, if you want to play around with it, please do not request access. I'm not going to give it to you guys. Select File, Make a Copy. File, Make a Copy. Don't try and request access. Thank you very much. Okay, so to wrap up this, the way you quantify the value of spots is to take frequency times the pot size times some performance metric that tells you what you should practice next. And the idea is very simple. We're going to measure the performance of different spots and practice until you slowly improve. So the very final part of this lecture is showing you how to practice against custom solutions. Now, we just put out a video about this, so I'll keep it brief. So you want to get started training next. Now, if you just have a starter or premium subscription, this spot importance method will still work just fine for you. What you need to do is open up your drills page and go and make different drills for different spots. So we have some pre-made drills here you can try if you don't want to set it up yourself. But you can also customize your drills. So for example, this is a button versus cutoff 3-bet pot test that I made using the dynamic algorithm. And there's my GTO Wizard score after 50 hands. Not a fantastic score. I will say that I find the dynamic algorithm is a little more punishing than the one where it just mixes every size and lets you get away with weird lines. When you're simplifying to one size, not quite so forgiving. However, it's very good practice. But if you want to test something a little more broad, you can do that as well. And you can always find your GTO Wizard score in these tables here. Just select your format, your drill, and practice it that way. Now, to make your own new drill, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new drill here. So first of all, we'll select our solution. Let me change that over to cache. And so if you're practicing pre-made solutions, of course, you just want to select one of these, but I want to show you how to make custom training solutions. So we're going to go ahead and set up a new solution, and let's go and pre-fill some spots. So let's say it's going to be a hijack versus cutoff 3-bet pot. All right, it's filled in the ranges, it's filled in the stack and the pot size. And let me go and we could use automatic trees. That's fine if you want to do that. I have my own dynamic bet sizing tree that I want to use for these types of spots. So let me go and find something that's good for a 3-bet pot. And this one will work great. So these ones have 25, 50, 75. And so 3-bet sizes, 3 raise sizes at each decision point. These are my optimized sizes for a 3-bet pot. These are the sizes I choose to practice. Okay? You can choose your own sizes. Make it as simple or as complicated as you want. I'm going to go ahead and create a new solution. All right. And let's go ahead and just give it a name. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to call this, what is this? Hijack versus cutoff 3-bet pot. Okay. Save. And you know what? Let's go ahead and just limit the session to 50 hands. We'll save it again. Hijack versus cutoff 3-bet pot, 50 hands. Sure. All right. And so we're going to go ahead and find that drill. Just a sec. And here's my new drill. You can see I've given it a little new drill tag so I can find it easily because I have many different drills. But from here, we can just simply practice it. We'll just hit start training. And just like that, we are diving into a practice session with our dynamic sizing tree just the way we want it. And what do you know? We flop top set. Let's check to the aggressor. They lead out. We'll go ahead and slow play this one. Check. They bet again. Oh, beautiful. We're just going to slow play. No need to rush. Check. All in. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And we take it down. So some tips and tricks for practicing against custom solutions. First of all, see our guide. Again, if you have a lead, try using dynamic. It's a totally different experience when it simplifies down to 1 bet size. It doesn't quite let you get away with as much nonsense, so you're kind of forced to learn like good lines. Save spots in advance, so like I like to make different drills for different spots. And something else you can try if you're lazy like me is to kind of merge the ranges in some spots. So for example, I don't want to practice like, low jack versus hijack and low jack versus cutoff and hijack versus cutoff. I just kind of all simplify this to early position versus middle position 3-bet pot. And so what I do is I just kind of average the ranges out a bit. And that just means I have less things to practice, and they're strategically similar enough that I don't care enough to learn the difference. But if you want something more nuanced, you do you. I'm just being a little lazy. Okay, guys, that's my lecture. Now, if you have any questions, leave them down as a comment below or reach out to our Discord server. We're always happy to talk theory there. That's my video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks for watching. And as always, happy grinding.